Economic sanctions are often seen as a go-to tool for governments seeking to influence the behavior of other nations without resorting to military action. Whether aimed at preventing nuclear proliferation, punishing human rights abuses, or curbing aggressive behavior, sanctions have become a common feature of international relations. But the question remains, do they actually work? The primary goal of sanctions is to create enough economic pressure to force a government or entity to change its behavior. In theory, by restricting trade, freezing assets, or blocking financial transactions, sanctions should make it difficult for a nation to function normally, leading to public dissatisfaction or a change in policy. However, the reality is often more complicated. Historically, some sanctions have been successful, but others have had mixed or even negative results. The effectiveness of sanctions is often determined by a variety of factors, including the economic resilience of the targeted nation, the unity of international enforcement, and the nature of the targeted leadership. One of the most famous examples of sanctions achieving their intended outcome is the case of South Africa. In the 1980s, global sanctions were imposed on South Africa to pressure its government to dismantle the apartheid system. These sanctions, including trade restrictions and divestment campaigns, contributed to the eventual fall of apartheid in 1994. The South African economy, heavily reliant on trade with Western countries, was deeply affected, leading to internal political changes. However, not all cases have followed this path. The economic sanctions imposed on Iraq in the 1990s after Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait had severe humanitarian consequences without achieving the primary goal of ousting Hussein from power. The sanctions crippled Iraq's economy, leading to widespread poverty, malnutrition, and the collapse of healthcare systems. But Hussein remained in control until the US-led invasion in 2003. In this case, sanctions arguably hurt the civilian population more than the regime, raising ethical questions about their use. More recently, sanctions against Russia following its 2014 annexation of Crimea and the 2022 invasion of Ukraine have had mixed results. After the 2014 sanctions, Russia's economy did suffer, with an estimated 2.5% drop in GDP and billions of dollars lost in investment. Yet despite this, Russia has remained defiant. Sanctions following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine have also led to economic pain for Russia, with the International Monetary Fund estimating a contraction of 8.5% in Russia's GDP in 2022 alone. But Russian resilience, partly due to the country's resource-rich economy and its ability to pivot trade toward countries like China and India, has raised doubts about the overall effectiveness of these measures in altering Russia's military strategy. The case of Iran offers another interesting perspective. Economic sanctions have been imposed on Iran for decades, primarily due to concerns about its nuclear program. These sanctions have severely hampered Iran's economy, reducing its oil exports and leading to inflation and unemployment. However, while sanctions brought Iran to the negotiating table, resulting in the 2015 nuclear deal, JCPOA, the eventual withdrawal of the US from the deal in 2018 saw sanctions reimposed. Since then, Iran has resumed aspects of its nuclear program, and domestic instability has grown. Iran's leadership has not buckled under pressure, and the sanctions have not brought about significant political change, showing the limits of this strategy. One of the reasons sanctions often fall short is that authoritarian governments are typically insulated from the economic pain felt by the general population. Sanctions can hurt ordinary citizens by driving up prices, reducing job opportunities, and restricting access to goods and services. But these hardships don't always translate into political change. In fact, authoritarian leaders often use sanctions as a rallying cry, blaming foreign interference for their country's woes and consolidating power by portraying themselves as defenders of national sovereignty. Data supports this trend. A 2019 study by the Peterson Institute for International Economics found that sanctions are successful in achieving their political goals only about 34% of the time. This low success rate can be attributed to the ability of targeted countries to find alternative trading partners or adopt black market strategies to bypass sanctions. For example, countries like Venezuela and North Korea have relied heavily on illicit activities, including drug trafficking and arms smuggling, to sustain their regimes despite long-standing sanctions. Another key factor in the effectiveness of sanctions is international cooperation. Unilateral sanctions, imposed by one country without the support of others, are often less effective than multilateral sanctions enforced by a coalition of nations. For instance, The sanctions imposed on North Korea by the United Nations, backed by most of the international community, have severely limited the country's access to global markets. Still, despite these efforts, North Korea has continued to develop its nuclear weapons program, illustrating that even multilateral sanctions can struggle to bring about the desired outcome when the targeted regime is deeply entrenched. One of the most critical elements in determining the success of sanctions is the economic strength and adaptability of the targeted country. For example, sanctions on smaller economies like Cuba and Venezuela have had a far more devastating impact than those imposed on larger, resource-rich nations like Russia or China. Venezuela's reliance on oil exports made it particularly vulnerable to U.S. sanctions, and its economy collapsed after oil exports were drastically reduced. Inflation skyrocketed to over 10 million% by 2019, and the country saw massive emigration as millions of people fled to escape poverty and food shortages. However, even in the face of economic ruin, the Venezuelan government has held on to power, and there has been no significant political change. By contrast, China has managed to weather various forms of economic pressure thanks to its robust, diversified economy and its vast network of trading partners. China's economic size and importance on the global stage make it difficult for sanctions to be truly effective. The country has also invested in developing its domestic industries and creating economic alternatives, reducing its reliance on Western markets. Sanctions, then, are far from a guaranteed solution to political problems. They can exert significant pressure on a nation's economy and its people, but their ability to force political change is often limited. The reasons for this are complex and involve the resilience of the targeted economy, the political structure of the nation in question, and the level of international cooperation. In conclusion, while economic sanctions are a powerful tool in international diplomacy, their track record is mixed. They can work when targeted at vulnerable regimes, especially when accompanied by international support and a clear diplomatic goal. However, they often fail to achieve their desired outcomes, particularly in authoritarian regimes, and can have severe humanitarian consequences. The numbers tell us that sanctions are effective in only about 1/3 of cases, raising serious questions about their continued use as a foreign policy tool.